Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Paramita and I heartily welcome you to my channel Paramita PM. If you are new to my channel, then I would request you to go through the content of my channel, look at the videos, and if you really find those videos helpful and if they really heighten your interest, then do like it, share it, and do not forget to subscribe to my channel. And most importantly, please turn on the notification bell button so that you get notified whenever I upload any new videos on my channel. So now, without any further ado, let's get into the lecture. Introduction to Classical Criticism. This PowerPoint lecture is about classical criticism. It will focus on a few terms related on a few relevant terms related to classical criticism, and then we will have a look at classical criticism briefly, and then you'll be introduced to Aristotle's Poetics, the background consisting of both social and literary. That is, the social and literary. We will also have a look at the social and literary context that led to the birth of poetics. In order to understand the meaning of the term classical criticism, or in order to understand classical criticism, it is very significant to understand what this very term classic means. So as you can see, the term classic means of the first rank, something that belongs to the first category, something that belongs to the first rank. So when we are talking about criticism that is labeled as classical, so we can say that it is criticism. It is a criticism of the first rank that is always placed in the first rank. So let us have a look at it now, that the term classic therefore means of the first rank. So a kind of criticism that belongs to the first rank, or a type of criticism that is of the first rank. And then who is a critic? Referring to someone who has the expertise to judge. Of course, that in order to be a critic, or let's say in order to criticize a piece of literature, it is essential for an individual to have that expertise, to have that knowledge on the basis of which he or she would evaluate a piece of literary work. And then that would give rise to criticism. So now let us have a look what this word criticism means. It means evaluation of a piece of work, expressing disapproval of it on the basis of perceived faults. So if I am a critic and I'm about to criticize or evaluate a work of literature, what I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to look at it very minutely and then evaluate it and express my disapproval. So I may come across a few things in that particular literary text which I do not agree with. So how am I going to criticize that text? I'm not just going to express my disagreement with certain aspects of that text, or I'm not just going to express my disapproval of it, but I'm also going to provide my own justification. Then only that criticism can turn out to be a fruitful one. So this is the disapproval on the basis of perceived faults. For example, if I'm going through the text and I find that this is not right, this is not wrong, this shouldn't have been written by the author, then on the basis of these loopholes or on the basis of these faults, I'm going to express my disapproval of that very word. So we can say that critic and criticism, these two terms are absolutely interrelated. Okay, and the function of a critic is to produce his criticism of a literary work on the basis of perceived faults. What is classical criticism? So as you can see, classical criticism emerged, or it originated in Greece in the 5th century BC. And the term classical literary criticism refers to both Greek and Roman civilizations. It means that classical literary criticism that emerged in Greece, it not just refers to the criticism, that developed or that emerged in Greece, but it refers to criticism that also developed in Rome in their civilization as well. So when we talk about classical criticism, it refers to both Greek and Roman civilizations, and this needs to be noted. Major figures of classical criticism are mainly Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and it refers to a conception, classical criticism. It refers to a conception of the nature and function of poetry and of verbal art. So, when we look at classical criticism, so what does it imply? What does it mean? It means that it refers to a conception of the nature, that what should be, the function of poetry, what should be the purpose of poetry, what should be the nature or role of poetry. And of course, therefore, classical criticism provides us with a conception, with an idea, with a view on the nature and function of poetry, and of course verbal art. By verbal art I mean eloquence, the art of speech, the art of eloquence. So classical criticism, therefore, it not only took into account, it not only took into consideration the nature and function of poetry, but it was also concerned about eloquence or speech. And classical critics, they felt, they considered speech or eloquence to be an art that can be learned, that can be developed. Okay, so therefore it is something, when you, like for example, a person who's a very good orator, so what makes him a good orator? It is the power of his speech. That means, which is equivalent to or which is similar to the power of eloquence, the art of speech. So when one is considered to be a good orator, it means that that person has developed the skillful art of speech, and therefore can deliver his speech in a very eloquent manner. So the classical critics felt that this is something, it is a skillful art, and it's not that one is born with this talent or with this skillful art, but this is something that could be learned. Focused more on style rather than content. Yes, classical criticism, because they believed that there should be some order. Okay, there should be some kind of order that poetry should follow, or any kind of art should follow. So therefore their emphasis was much more on style rather than the subject matter or the content. So they put much emphasis on clarity, orderliness. Like I said, that every piece of art or every art, should have a perfect order. There should be a proper balance with a sense of decorum governing all elements. So it seems that they followed a set of rules. They followed a set of rules which would, govern all elements of art. The approach, therefore, so their approach, as you can see, was formal, something that was criticized by the 18th century critics, considering it to be too rationalistic and formal. Now, this is very interesting because the 18th century critics, they criticized this approach of the classical critics, because they felt that instead of looking on the content, they were being too rationalistic. Their approach to poetry was quite limited. Their approach, let's say, their approach to poetry, was very formal. Okay, and therefore too rationalistic. Like they only followed, like I said, they'd only followed a few rules and regulations. Okay, and they felt that this should be the order, and this is how all the elements constituting art should be regulated. So these classical principles determined which work of art would become canonical. So if you look at this very point, that they laid emphasis on clarity. So if a work of art fails to have clarity, orderliness, proper decorum, or say proper balance, then it means that that particular work of art does not follow these classical principles. They fail to have these classical principles, and therefore they should never be canonized. They should never become canonical. So their emphasis, they put much emphasis on these classical principles, on the basis of which they determined whether a work of art should be canonized or not. Aristotle's Poetics. So let us have a look at the background of this seminal text in classical literary criticism. This particular slide provides a very short, a very brief background to poetics, and we will look at it in detail. We will discuss it in the very next slide. So let's see when Poetics was composed. So Poetics, Aristotle's Poetics was composed around 330 BC. Now, it is believed that there are mainly, two common answers that are available to readers, regarding the purpose of poetics. Firstly, the first answer that is available is that partly poetics is Aristotle's response to his teacher Plato's views on poetry, or maybe he provided, he wanted to provide an answer to his teacher's condemnation of poetry. He wanted to refute it, okay, and therefore he wanted to provide his own answer. So therefore he wrote Poetics. The other one being, which is a common belief again, that Aristotle intended to provide practical advice for poets, that how they should write poetry, what kind of poetry they should write, what should be the subject matter of poetry, what are the pros and cons that they should take into consideration while writing poetry. But the main reason or the main purpose of poetics that often appears to be unknown to readers is that Aristotle actually aimed to lay down, the basis, the foundation for a proper literary criticism. When he wrote Poetics, and when you will be studying Poetics, when you will look at the content of this text, you will find that what he does, he lays down the fundamental principles, the fundamental principles of art, okay, or let's say that are exemplified in art. For example, whether it is comedy, tragedy, or epic poetry. Okay, so what he basically does, he tries to lay down the foundation for a proper literary criticism. And yes, it is of course true that if we take into account the literary criticism before Aristotle, then we shall see that his teacher, Plato, he condemned poetry. Okay, because for him, Plato very clearly mentions in his book Republic that he considers, actually this this reflects Plato's views on poetry, because he thinks that poetry is nothing but a copy. It is a mere representation of appearances. Whatever things or whatever objects are there around us, what a poet does, he simply copies it. So therefore it is false. And so he thinks that poetry is immoral, it is misleading, it misguides readers, it is based on falsehood, it is imitative, and therefore untrue in nature. We can never rely on poetry, and therefore the poet should be banished from a perfect society. Okay, this is very briefly about what Plato felt about poetry. Social and literary background. It is very essential, I believe, in order to understand the views of both Plato and Aristotle. It is very essential for us to be aware of the background, both social and literary. And then in the meantime, like in order to consider, or in order to let's say in order to understand what led, or what factors gave birth to Aristotle's Poetics, we cannot take into consideration, Plato's views on poetry. This is something that which we can never ignore while studying Aristotle's Poetics. So now if we look at the several aspects that I have mentioned in this very slide, the existing social situation of the time. Now during that time, in Athens, like the scene like it was one of a political decline and dissolution. This needs to be understood. So, when a society is in a state of political decline and dissolution, it is quite natural that the condition or the plight of education wouldn't be good either. Okay, and as far as Homer is concerned, Homer's epics were a part of the school curriculum, but then it was also, Homer's writings were also criticized. Why? Because those aspects of the text, that criticized or that portrayed gods in an unfavorable light, they were completely disapproved of by philosophers and educationists. Then if we take into account the position of women, it wasn't high. They were not allowed, to educate themselves. They didn't have any right to be a part of politics or religious matters. Even slavery was prevalent. And the virtues, that were admired, or let's say the qualities, the good qualities that were worshipped even by the Greeks, they were like courage, let's say heroism, and of course skillful use of arms. When Aristotle, in Poetics, he talks of the tragic hero, that he should be a morally good person. This is a quote unquote good. This term had a different meaning for the Greeks. What Aristotle emphasizes on means by, or what Aristotle means by, implies by the word good, it is something completely different that was worshipped, or let's say that was believed in or admired by the Greeks. Then if I talk about the literary scenario, so like I said, a society which is in a state of decline, so their education was declining, like there was political decline, and even literature of the period was in a state of decline. So the golden age of Greek literature was already, it was already past. And therefore, literature, the kind of literature that was produced during that time appeared to be corrupted, immoral, and not at all of a very high level. And this kind of literature gave rise to criticism. And this kind of poetry, it failed to attract readers, instead aroused criticism because of its immoral nature, like I said, because of its corrupted nature. So now you will gradually, understand, like, this was the situation, this was how, people looked at poetry. They considered it to be immoral, corrupt. So now you can see that how that foundation was laid down. Okay, and this influenced Plato's. This is a factor that influenced Plato's influenced, Plato's views on poetry, and therefore made him attack it. Now, literary criticism before Aristotle, that is Plato's condemnation of poetry. Like I said, it is very, very important to understand this very point. Now, Plato's attack, so therefore we can say this was the social situation, this was the literary situation as well. So Plato's condemnation of poetry, or his attack on poetry, actually meant that, or actually, when he condemned poetry, he meant to say that philosophers, therefore were superior. And therefore he considered philosophers to be superior to poets. Now here we must understand the fact that Plato was a great philosopher, and it is not that he wasn't aware of the greatness of poetry, the magical quality of poetry. He was very much aware of it, and maybe because of this extreme, this acute awareness of poetry, that he banished poets from the republic, or from his republic of ideal citizens and statesmen, because he felt that the influence of a poet can never be good, because he considers poetry to be imitative, in nature, to be untrue, to be false. So therefore he felt that from a perfect republic, poets should be banished, and therefore he condemned poetry. And you should also note that it's not that Plato did not respect Homer. He did respect. In fact, he respected him much, Homer. But then still, he was not at all ready to give poets any place in an ideal state. For example, or let's say, here I would like to, why Plato, attacked poetry. There must be some grounds, right? So, firstly, Plato, like I said, if we take into consideration the intellectual grounds on the basis of which Plato condemned poetry or attacked poetry, then uh, it says that Plato basically, Plato considered poetry to be a copy of the world of senses and appearances. Like I said, it is imitative in nature. It's a copy, therefore it is not real, therefore it is untrue. And therefore, according to Plato, poets do not have any knowledge of truth, but they are simply given to imitation, and therefore their poetry is nothing but a copy of a copy. So one, like for example, if I talk about rose, so according to Plato, there is an ideal rose, okay, and the rose that we see around us, it is a copy of that perfect rose, that ideal rose which represents truth. So that is the first copy of that ideal rose. And now what a poet does, he simply, or what an artist does, he simply, copies, represents that rose that is available to us around us. So according to Plato, it is twice removed from reality. And therefore, according to him, he criticized poets, saying that they are completely unaware of the ideal world of concepts. And it is this ideal world of concepts that consist of truth, let's say virtue, and beauty. So what the poets do, they simply copy this world around us, and which is a reflection of the ideal. So it can serve no useful function. This is the intellectual ground on the basis of which Plato attacked poetry or advocated the banishment of poets from an ideal republic. Now, if I take into consideration if we look into the moral grounds, then like I said, since the art produced by a poet is untrue, imitative, false, therefore poets do cast a very bad influence on social morality. And then they say, Plato says that poetry, therefore, it tells lies about gods, because like I told you, that even in Homer's epics, those parts where gods are, not portrayed or represented in a very good light, those were criticized by philosophers. They couldn't accept it. Okay, so according to Plato, poetry is something that, simply portrays, or let's say represents God as corrupt, and they tell tales of immorality. And therefore, and so on the basis of which this will lead to the corruption of public taste and morals. And even, for Plato, so therefore this should be kept in mind, and therefore poets should be banished from the ideal republic. So we can see that Plato condemns poetry on the basis of intellectual grounds as well as moral grounds, and he also feels that poetry is something that shouldn't be read because it corrupts the public taste. It casts a very bad influence on the public test, and or it is also immoral in nature. Okay, and it shouldn't be encouraged. Why? Because it produces lies. It is nothing but a copy. It is imitative in quality, in nature, and therefore untrue. These are the intellectual and moral grounds that I discussed in the earlier slide. Now, talking about emotional grounds laid down by Plato in order to discourage poetry, is that Plato attacks poetry on emotional grounds, saying that poetry is something that always encourages our passions. It always encourages our desires. Okay, and according to him, emotions and desires, or let's say passions, these are something that should be dried, while poetry does just the opposite. As far as Plato is concerned, Plato was not at all, let's say he never trusted emotions, because he felt that emotions, uh, they create a kind of illusion in the human mind, and then we get influenced by our emotions, we become weak. Okay, and this is something that stands contradictory to what philosophy says. And so that's why he prefers philosophers to poets, and he believed that philosophers are much superior to poets. So, according to Plato, poetry is something that doesn't allow men to nurture reason. Rather, it gives indulgence to all kinds of emotions which weaken us. Okay, create, let's say, emotional turmoil, emotional disturbances. Okay, so according to Plato, we come under the effect of poetry, we get influenced by poetry, and these create emotional disturbances in us, something that, we should be ashamed of in real life. So, poetry causes imbalance, and it doesn't allow us to control our emotional state. Rather, it encourages it, and in the process, what happens? Our reasoning, the power of reasoning, it gets subdued. So, according to Plato, like I said, he's attacking poetry on emotional grounds. He says that this poetry simply, when a poet is this poetry is nothing but the result of irrational emotional impulses. Okay, and when a poet writes, he writes out of these irrational emotional impulses in a state of frenzy. When a poet is in a state of irrational frenzy, then only he produces poetry. So their work can never be regarded as true craft. And it is on on the basis of these emotional grounds that Plato attacks poetry, he condemns poetry, and he feels that philosophy is superior to poetry because, unlike poetry, according to Plato, philosophy has the quality, or let's say, philosophy is suitable for us, is suitable for men, because it has the quality to nurture us, to educate the young people than poetry. And philosophy is, let's say, is also capable of curing this society. Okay, it can cure it can cure society of any kind of corruption or depravity. So, according to Plato, we can say that poetry fails to provide a moral guide, while philosophy is capable of providing a moral guide, or let's say a guide to good behavior. And so he conveniently, here, this is a loophole in his criticism, because he conveniently ignores the fact that the ground on the basis of which he accuses poetry, that it is imitative, this imitation, quote unquote, can actually stimulate us. It can actually help human nature and elevate human nature. The problem that lies with Plato's criticism, or Plato's attack on poetry, is that he only focuses on the bad effects, on the negative impacts of poetry, and he completely ignores that even imitation can help us learn a lot. And this is something that is emphasized or highlighted by Aristotle in his criticism. So therefore we can see that that's why this I have mentioned this point, that philosophers versus poets, whereby philosophers are, placed on a higher level than poets, according to Plato. And so the competition between philosophy and poetry arises. As far as Plato is concerned, we saw that for Plato, poetry is imitative in nature and therefore untrue, false, immoral. So he uses the term, imitation for poetry in a derogatory sense, in a negative light. He relates it to poetry in a negative light. While when we look at Aristotle, okay, we find that he uses the term imitation in a very positive way, because he feels that it is a creative process. Now, according to Aristotle, we human beings, since our birth, we have the natural propensity to imitate. For instance, here, if I give the example of a child, we all have noticed that how, children, they have this tendency to emulate the adults, okay, the way they dress, the way they walk. And nowadays we find very little children, maybe 3 years old, a child, we find a 3 years old holding the mobile phone, okay, and walking up and down in a way as if he or she is involved in a very serious conversation. So what is that child trying to do? Don't you think that that child is, simply trying to emulate what is seen by him or her? So like Aristotle believed that we human beings have the tendency to emulate, to copy since our birth. And according to him, this doesn't have any negative impact, because this helps us learn. So according to Aristotle, imitation is a creative process, okay, and it widens, the scope. And so we cannot say that it is mere mimicry, okay, but according to him, there is some truth in it as well. And so according to Aristotle, a poet is greater than a philosopher or a historian. Why? Because he is creating something by imitating reality, while Plato is saying that the poet is imitating the reality and therefore it is unreal. It is twice removed from reality. While Aristotle says that no, it is a creative process, because the poet involves himself in creating something new by imitating, by copying the real. Then the next point is, so all these points would let us know Aristotle's views on poetry and how it differs completely, drastically from that of Plato's. Aristotle compares poetry to music, unlike Plato, who compares it to painting. So like I said, when Plato was talking about imitation, when he was talking about the imitative quality of poetry, he compared it to that of an artist, okay, to painting. So he says that what a painter does, he simply copies it, okay, something is already made available to him, which is also a copy of the ideal, okay, and then he copies it and produces it on the canvas, okay. So he compares it to painting and looks upon it as a derogatory process, while when it comes to Aristotle, we find that he is comparing poetry, to music. And it is here that Aristotle becomes successful in refuting Plato's charge of poetry, that it simply imitates, So according to Aristotle, like music, poetry has the capacity, to soothe our soul internally as well as externally. It can capture our soul. So internally as well as externally, poetry provides us with that essence of experience. So according to Aristotle, it is wise to compare poetry to music than to painting. Then poetry idealizes the reality. What what Plato is saying, that poetry doesn't idealize, rather poetry imitates, produces a false representation of the reality, while Aristotle is saying that no, poetry idealizes the reality, because Aristotle says that what things should be like, or what things can be. This makes the poet very, very creative. So maybe something he imitates something, okay, and then he idealizes it. He produces, or maybe the way he produces it, okay, is very, very ideal. So this idealistic quality is attached to poetry by Aristotle. So because he says that uh, uh, poetry is concerned with, what should be or what can be, therefore making it a very, very creative process. When it comes to Plato, we saw that he said that poetry, shouldn't be encouraged at all, because it simply waters our passions. It simply waters our desires, and like encourages us, or let's say influences us to subdue our reason. But here, whatever is said by Aristotle is very, very sane, in the sense that Plato thinks that human emotions are, these emotions that we all have, this is something very, very bad for mankind, for humanity, and therefore it should never be encouraged, it should be avoided. Instead, reasoning, the power of reasoning should be always encouraged. This is something where you and I would not agree with Plato at all. Rather, we would appreciate what Aristotle says. Aristotle says that emotions should be always encouraged, and it must be given an outlet to express itself. Emotions should be nurtured, emotions should be encouraged, because according to Aristotle, these emotions do not have any bad effect, or these emotions do not have any bad impact on humanity. Aristotle therefore appreciates poetry for its healthy, positive effects on man. Plato simply talked about the bad effects, that it is immoral, okay, and like it is immoral, and it should be discouraged. Therefore, because it encourages our emotions. But Aristotle says, he proves rather, that whether morally, intellectually, or emotionally, poetry should be praised for its healthy, positive effects on man. Okay, and here when we will when we come across his concept of catharsis, this proves it, that how the effects of poetry can be healthy, how when emotions are given an outlet, okay, and when we are able to express our emotions freely, how it soothes, how it calms our mind. So this was Aristotle's views on poetry.